The rain had been falling for hours when the cart pulled up to the gates of the Briar Glen Orphan Asylum. Thunder groaned low across the hills as the matron stepped out with her lantern raised, squinting through the sheets of gray. She found no driver, no horse, just the boy, sitting alone beneath the cart's half-torn canopy, soaked but perfectly still. He made no noise. His limbs hung loose at his sides, not in fear, but in something quieter, something practiced. When she asked his name, he did not answer. He only handed her a sketch pad, its edges warped from rain. Inside, on the first page, drawn in pale graphite, was a building, a church, unfamiliar in design. Tall and narrow, with a tower made of bone-like spires, its doorways curved like mouths caught mid-scream. The matron looked back at the boy. He was staring at her, unblinking, his eyes so light they almost appeared blank. She called him Eli because there was no other name, no papers, no note, just that picture and a tag on his boot with the number 31 stitched in red thread. At Briar Glen, such things were not uncommon. Children appeared, others disappeared. Record-keeping was secondary to survival. Still, there was something in the way the other orphans avoided him, instinctive, like animals parting around a dead thing in the grass. He spoke to no one. He did not cry. He did not fight or bite or act out like the others. He only drew and watched. The staff told themselves he was just slow, maybe traumatized. The matron told herself he would warm up. But after the first week, she began to wake in the night with the feeling that someone was sitting outside her door. When she checked, no one was there, only the scent of old stone and wet earth clinging to the air. She began noticing oddities. Candles are missing from the chapel. Chalk scraped into arcs beneath bunk beds. Children sleep-talked about the stairs in the field, though there were no stairs and certainly no field. Eli was always nearby, never moving quickly, never touching anyone, yet always present in the aftermath of strange things. One morning, the cook found every pantry jar of molasses emptied and smeared into a large spiral across the cellar floor. When asked who did it, none of the children spoke, but they all turned their eyes toward the far bunk where Eli sat, drawing something they couldn't quite see, a structure with 3 steeples and something hanging from the middle one. The page was filled with graphite, so dark it shimmered oily in the light. By the end of the second week, the matron noticed something else. Eli never blinked, not once, not in sunlight, not in candlelight, not even when she tried to make him flinch by snapping her fingers close to his eyes. It wasn't a game. His gaze wasn't hollow. It was bottomless, like the part of a well that had no echo. She asked the local doctor to look him over, but when the man came, Eli wouldn't open his mouth. The doctor tried to pry it with a wooden stick, but Eli bit down so hard it snapped. When he looked at her afterwards, something passed between them. Not fear, not anger. Just the quiet certainty of someone who could wait longer than death. The drawings grew more intricate. What began as crude outlines of churches became full interior schematics, pews arranged in uneven rows, staircases that led downward in impossible spirals, pulpits lined with teeth. The most recent sketch showed the orphanage itself, but altered. Its roof was gone, replaced by a circular dome. Around the dome, dozens of faces, wide-eyed, weeping, screaming, were pressed into the architecture as if the building itself had consumed them. The matron ripped that page out, burnt it. The next day she found the same image drawn again, this time carved into the back of the chapel door deep into the wood. One night she entered the dormitory after hearing soft tapping. It was nearly midnight. The children were asleep, all except Eli, who stood at the far window tapping his fingers rhythmically against the glass. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps again. His breath did not fog the pain. When she stepped closer, she saw the reflection in the glass wasn't hers. It was a door, stone, ancient-looking, and just before it faded, she thought she saw a child behind it. Mouth open, knocking back. She barred the chapel after that, though she never said why. Told the staff not to let the children near the old well behind the courtyard. As for Eli, she moved him to his own room, the smallest, the coldest, with a locked door. But locks are for those who believe in the solidness of wood and iron. Whatever Eli was, he had arrived not with questions but with purpose. And every night, while the other children dreamt of homes they couldn't remember, Eli sat awake, unblinking, sketching doorways no one had ever built. Yet, by the 3rd week, silence began to shift from a condition to a presence. The air in Briar Glen Orphan Asylum grew heavier at night, like the walls themselves were listening. Several children started waking with blood on their lips from biting their tongues in their sleep. Some cried without knowing why. Others simply stared at the same shadowed corner of the dormitory as if something waited there. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. The matron dismissed it as hysteria. She said the cold always brought bad dreams, especially for the small ones. But the fear wasn't just in their minds. It showed in the way they refused to play near that corner, in how they began sleeping in pairs, curled close like prey beneath a hawk. When the staff rearranged the beds, the children moved them back by morning, always away from that far left wall. No adult ever saw anything there. But none of them volunteered to check twice. It was around then that sleepwalking began. At first, just one girl, Nora, 6, usually quiet, was found in the hallway barefoot, staring at the painting of St. Jerome as though waiting for it to speak. When gently led back to bed, she wept but said she didn't know why. A week later, 3 boys were found in the chapel at dawn, kneeling in perfect silence. Their hands were pressed together as if in prayer, but their mouths were stuffed with grass and bits of charcoal. None had any memory of how they got there. One wet himself when asked who had led them. Eli, meanwhile, slept undisturbed, always on his side, always holding his sketchpad tight against his chest. He never sleepwalked. He never screamed. He simply slept, eyes closed but somehow aware, like a sleeper who had already seen what others only dreamed of. The matron began locking his door at night, but in the mornings it was always open again. No marks on the keyhole, no signs of tampering. Just that same quiet room and the boy inside, already awake, waiting with a new drawing. What he drew now was not the church as it first appeared. That earlier sketch with its crooked steeple and unsettling geometry was gone. In its place was something colder, larger. The church had grown taller, but now its base was surrounded by uneven headstones, some broken, others half-sunken. One grave had been dug open, and within it Eli had drawn a mirror. There was no reflection, just a black void. The matron tore that page out too, but again the next day it returned. Only this time the mirror in the grave held the faint outline of a child's face, eyes wide, mouth open as though screaming beneath the soil. Children refused to sleep near Eli now. Some covered their heads with blankets. Others refused to sleep at all. One boy, Isaac, clawed at his own chest until he bled, saying something was pulling him from the inside. He was sedated and locked in the infirmary, but he managed to carve a phrase into the wooden bed frame before passing out. 3 words, rough and shaky. Stop the bell. There had been no bell, not in years. The old church bell tower had collapsed decades ago. But late one night, 2 nurses claimed they heard it toll. Once, then silence. The unlit corner of the dormitory grew colder each week. No fire warmed it. No lantern lasted long in its presence. And though the matron denied it, some staff began whispering that it was no longer just a shadowed part of the room. It was something deeper. A thinning, a place where rules bent, where footsteps stopped echoing. Eli never glanced at it. He didn't need to. His drawings now showed it clearly, a crack in the church floor expanding outward like a wound. From that crack, a single line extended across every page. When connected, the line formed a shape none of them recognized. But the children, in their nightmares, began to trace it in the air as they slept, over and over. As if trying to finish something Eli had already started. The scratching began so softly that no one believed it at first. The wind played tricks in old buildings, and Briar Glen was filled with places that groaned and shifted. But this was different. It came at the same hour every night, just before 3, and always from the same stretch of wall behind the girls' dormitory. Light, frantic scraping, like nails dragged across wood, too small and too sharp to be from rodents. The children grew too afraid to sleep near it. One girl, Clara, claimed something whispered behind the wall when she laid her ear close. When the matron asked what it said, Clara only shook her head and refused to speak again for 3 days. By the end of the week, the sound grew louder. Not every night, not in the same rhythm, but enough to leave claw marks deep in the minds of those who heard it. The staff dismissed it until they began hearing it too. That awful, steady scritching just beneath the plaster, like something trying to carve its way out. Finally, the matron called in the handyman, an old veteran named Jonas, who'd worked at Briar Glen longer than anyone could remember. He was the kind of man who didn't scare easily. But something in his face changed the moment he laid his hand against the wall. He said nothing. Just fetched his tools and began to pry. The panel came loose with a groan, spilling decades of dust into the room. Behind it, where there should have been brick and lath, there was a small hidden cavity, no bigger than a child's crawl space. Inside were burlap sacks, 6 of them tied shut with twine darkened by time and something else. Jonas untied one, then stumbled back without a word. The matron leaned in and froze. Inside were teeth, dozens of them, tiny milk-white human teeth. Some are still stained with blood. Some are not even fully formed. Each one had been sewn into the fabric with black thread, arranged in circular patterns like suns made of bone. The other sacks held more of the same, row after row, each more unsettling in design. But it was what lay behind the sacks that silenced the room. Burnt into the wooden beam carved deeply into the heart of the frame itself was a single word. Abigail. No surname, no date, just that name. Scorched into the wood like a scar. The matron immediately went to the old rosters. She checked every year, every record, even the ones kept before her time. There was no Abigail listed. Not now, not ever. No child by that name had lived in Briar Glen, not officially. But when she showed the name to one of the older girls, the ones who still remembered the previous winters, the child turned pale and whispered that she had heard the name in her dreams, always whispered from the floorboards, always begging not to be forgotten. Jonas insisted on sealing the wall back up, but not before laying salt along the base and hanging a small crucifix over the new panel. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. That night the scratching stopped, but the dreams began. Nearly every child in that wing reported waking with the taste of blood in their mouths. One girl, Elsie, coughed up a baby tooth she swore she'd already lost the year before. Another was found holding a sliver of wood carved with the same name, Abigail, pressed into her palm so tightly it left a welt. The matron tried to burn the sacks, but the fabric wouldn't catch. Even soaked in oil, they only smoked, filling the furnace room with a thick, sweet smell like rotting fruit. She eventually buried them in the old garden behind the tool shed, the spot where nothing had grown for years. By morning, the soil was covered in mushrooms shaped like tiny hands. Eli said nothing, but his drawings changed. The church was still there, still looming and skeletal, but now a small figure stood at its base. A girl in a tattered dress, her face scratched out entirely. Around her neck was a string of teeth. She stood beside an open wall behind which were rows of heads without mouths, each skull sewn shut with black thread. The detail was grotesque, too precise for a child, too correct in its proportions. When asked who the girl was, Eli simply turned the page. The next drawing showed the inside of the dormitory. In the corner, the one the children feared, a shape was curled up, tiny, thin hands pressed to its ears. Above her, scrawled in looping graphite, was the phrase, "I didn't scream." Jonas quit the following day. He left without pay, without farewell, saying only that the walls weren't built right, that they remembered things. The matron never told the diocese what had been found. She filed no report, but she began sleeping with a candle lit at all hours. And from then on, every child admitted to Briar Glen was checked, not just for lice or illness, but for missing teeth, because something or someone had been counting. And in the silence between the scratching, it had never stopped. It was just before dawn when they found Peter. The washroom floor was slick with water, puddled in unnatural patterns like something had been dragged. The old tin basin used for boiling linens was still full, but the water had gone still and murky, as if it had absorbed more than just dirt. Peter's body was folded inside, face down, limbs loose like he'd been placed there rather than fallen. His nightshirt was bunched around his waist and one of his slippers sat upright by the doorway, untouched. He'd been a quiet child, pale, curious, known for biting his nails and humming when nervous. He wasn't the kind to sneak off, and certainly not into the dark alone. The matron was the first to speak the word accident. She said perhaps he'd come to fetch water, slipped on the stone floor and fell in. But the basin was barely deep enough to submerge his chest, and Peter had been nearly 9. Strong, healthy, and tall for his age. And even if he'd hit his head, why was there no bruise, no abrasion? The attending nurse found no marks at all, no water in the lungs, no broken bones, no torn skin. He drowned without drowning, as though the air had simply stopped inside him, as though the water had reached into him without ever entering his mouth. They buried Peter 2 days later in the cold field behind the chapel. The grave was shallow, the ground frozen, and few children attended. Some refused to come out of fear. Others seemed dazed, like something in their sleep had left them hollow. One girl, Miriam, kept pointing at the trees during the burial, whispering that Peter was still there, hanging above the basin, watching. She would not stop. That night she tore her bed sheets into strips and tied them to the frame of her bunk, each knot exact, each loop tight, like no child should know how. Eli did not attend the burial. He remained in his room, sketchpad on his knees, charcoal dust coating his fingers like ash. When the matron entered to check on him, he did not look up. He simply slid the new drawing toward her, his hands steady, eyes vacant. The image made her throat close. It showed Peter suspended above the laundry basin by thin cords attached not to the ceiling but to nothing at all. The ropes twisted into strange loops, forming symbols unfamiliar yet sickeningly deliberate. His limbs hung like marionette strings that had gone slack, and his head tilted as if listening to something she could not hear. The basin below him was empty, but its shadow stretched long across the floor, too long, reaching into a black corner of the page. She took the drawing and locked it in her drawer, but the next morning another appeared beneath her door. Same composition. Only now were Peter's eyes open and looking straight at her. By the end of the week, the laundry basin was drained and sealed. No one spoke of it. But the silence grew heavier. Children began whispering things, brushing their feet under the beds. Wet footsteps that vanished before leaving the hallway. One boy woke up screaming, his fingernails cracked and packed with lye. Another said he heard Peter humming inside the furnace. The matron tried to remove Eli's sketchpad again. She demanded he stop drawing, but when she entered his room, she found the pad untouched and Eli staring not at her but at the ceiling, where a series of knotted shoelaces now hung like crude prayer beads. She didn't ask how they'd gotten there. She didn't want to know. That night she dreamt of the washroom, but it was not as it had been. It was deeper, colder. The walls were stone. The basin had grown tall, more like a baptismal font. She saw Peter, not as a child, but as a figure without a face, dripping and still. Behind him stood Eli, eyes bright and mouth finely open, speaking in loops, words layered on top of each other like a chant unspooling. She woke up gasping, the sound of dripping echoing in her ears long after it should have stopped. In the days that followed, the air inside Briar Glen changed. The pipes moaned without use. Towels dried slowly, staying damp for days. Several children began sleepwalking again, always toward the washroom, always barefoot. Eli watched from the window as they were led back. His drawings began to change. Now the church was shown with water pooling around its base, steps leading downward into a submerged chamber, and small white shapes floating beneath the surface. Teeth, buttons, and fingers bent gently like they were still reaching. Peter had been the first. But the way the drawing shifted, the way the air thickened, the way children began to hum at night without knowing it, something else was starting. And Eli, quiet as ever, never blinked. He only watched, and drew, and waited. Father Thomas Halloway arrived at Briar Glen just after the frost turned to mud. He was younger than the parish had expected. Barely 30, hair still thick and dark, face untouched by time or doubt. The diocese had sent him quietly, under the pretense of assisting with sacramental records and reviewing the finances of church-run orphan institutions in the region. But beneath that, they'd tasked him with something far less administrative. Rumors had spread, whispers about death without reason, about strange drawings, about a boy. The bishop had told him not to interfere, just observe, verify, and report. But from the moment he stepped inside the orphanage, Father Halloway felt something else had brought him there. The building felt wrong, not broken, not haunted, but deeply tired, as if the stone itself was holding in a breath. He noticed the way the children stared too long, the way the staff paused before speaking certain names, and the way even the crucifixes on the walls seemed duller, like they'd been left too long in shadow. He met the matron briefly, a pale, stiff woman named Mabel Crane who had worked there since the cholera years. Her office was cluttered but organized, and when he asked for the ledgers, she hesitated only a moment before handing over the books. She said nothing about Eli. She didn't need to. He was already in the margins. Father Halloway spent 2 nights reviewing the finances. They were irregular but not criminal. Donations misfiled, supply purchases unlogged, nothing new. But the 3rd night, while scanning the oldest entries, he noticed something strange. The wooden ledger case beneath the desk wasn't flush against the wall. Behind it, tucked inside a hollowed section of the floorboard, was a thin black book wrapped in cloth. It had no title, no emblem. The pages inside were handwritten, tight and careful, with a list of names that didn't appear in any other registry. Each name had a line drawn through it in red ink. Some names had dates beside them. Others had only Latin phrases: sine voce, sine lumina, lacrimare usque ad finmen. He didn't understand them all, but they chilled him. What disturbed him more was that some of the phrases looked familiar. The handwriting, though not identical, mirrored the looping symbols he'd seen days earlier in a child's sketch that had been confiscated by staff. He had glimpsed it briefly, a tower with faces instead of windows, and beneath it the words, Silentium Vivit. The same words appeared beside a name in the book. The name had no surname, only an initial, E. He took the ledger to his room. He cross-referenced every name with the official baptism and burial logs. Only 4 matched. The rest, over 24, had no trace. They had not been buried through the church. They had not been transferred. They had not, according to any record, ever existed. And yet there they were, listed, dated, crossed out. In one section, beside a cluster of 5 names marked over the same week in 1879, he found a small ink sketch. Not a face, not a building, but a symbol, a spiral made of interlocking knots. He had seen it carved into the hallway banister just days before. When he asked about it, the matron said it was only children scratching nonsense. He returned to her office the next morning and asked if she kept any private journals. She did not answer. She only asked if the books had been sufficient for his audit. He said yes. But that night, while walking past her quarters, he heard her sobbing. Not loudly, but steadily, the way someone does when the grief has no shape, only weight. Father Halloway began leaving notes in the chapel. He copied the Latin phrases from the black book and placed them beneath the crucifix, hoping someone might recognize them. A week later, he found them returned, each line circled with new words written beneath in the same pale charcoal used by the children. Not one child confessed to doing it. The handwriting did not match any staff member, but the script, looping, thin, exact, was identical to the one he'd seen in Eli's sketchpad. He sought out Eli, hoping to ask gently, to learn without pressure. But when he found the boy alone in the courtyard, staring into the empty bird bath, he froze. Eli wasn't drawing. He was tracing. His fingers moved in the air, sketching the same spiral he had seen in the ledger, slow and steady, as if remembering something carved into his bones. When Father Halloway finally spoke, Eli turned and blinked once, the first and only time anyone saw him do so. And in that single blink, the priest felt something close behind his eyes, as though something ancient had just recognized him. He returned to his room and locked the door. That night he read the final page of the black ledger. It held no names, only a date written in red, August 3rd, 1883, and beneath it one sentence in Latin. Roughly translated, it read, "The mouth is closed. The door will open." He did not sleep that night. Not because he feared death, but because something in the room had begun breathing with him, and he no longer believed it needed permission to enter. The children's choir at Briar Glen had once been the only sound of warmth in the cold stone halls. Soft voices layered in innocent harmony, echoing through chapel, arches too tall for their purpose. Rehearsals were held twice a week, led by Sister Clara, a thin, tremulous woman whose hands always shook slightly when she played the organ. The children were chosen for their pitch, not their pasts, and most sang only because it kept them warm and watched. That December morning, the sun barely crept through the frost-fogged windows as the choir took their usual places on the front steps of the chapel. The matron sitting quietly near the back with Father Halloway not far behind, scribbling notes that now meant nothing. The song began as expected, a slow hymn used in Advent, low and soft. The children's voices swelled together, rising with the melody. Then, on the third verse, mid-phrase, the music broke, not with a cough or a scream, but a sharp silence. 8 children froze in place, mouths open, eyes wide. Their chests stopped moving, no gasping, no sound, just stillness, as if the air had been stolen all at once. For several long seconds, time halted. Then the first fell. One after another, they collapsed to the floor, limp, hands twitching as if underwater. Panic swept through the chapel like a cold wind. Sister Clara screamed. The other children scattered. Staff rushed to the altar. Father Halloway knelt beside one of the girls, Lena, age 10, and tried to feel a pulse. Her lips had turned blue. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, she took in a breath, long and loud, like she'd been drowning in a room full of air. One by one, the rest followed, jolting back to life, each drawing ragged breaths that echoed strangely against the stone walls. No one could explain it. There had been no poison, no sickness, no trauma to the throat or chest. The nurse found no swelling, no blockage, and when the children were asked what happened, not one could remember the moment the silence began. That night the chapel was locked, the choir was disbanded, and Sister Clara, unable to stop shaking, left her room and wandered the corridors until morning, reciting psalms beneath her breath. She never played again. Eli was not in the choir. He had never sung, never shown interest in music. But when the matron visited his room that evening, the sketchpad on his desk had already turned to a new page. The drawing was simple but terrible in its clarity. A tower, the same skeletal church he'd always drawn, now shone from the rear. Its belfry loomed in sharp angles, and from its top beam hung 8 thin ropes, perfectly spaced, swinging slightly as if stirred by wind. From each noose dangled a shape, not quite bodies, but not anything else they could be. Their faces were blank, their legs dangled. Below them, written in faint graphite, was a phrase in Latin. The priest translated it the next morning. 8 mouths open, none will speak. Something about the incident never left the children. Even those who hadn't collapsed began covering their mouths in their sleep, waking with bruises across their ribs, as if they'd been trying to breathe through walls. One boy locked himself in the root cellar and stuffed his ears with candle wax, whispering that the bell would call again. Another cut off the strings from every coat and boot he owned. When asked why, he said the hanging ropes were looking for replacements. The matron filed no report to the diocese. Father Halloway did, but received no reply. The choir room was stripped, the hymnals burnt, but Eli still drew. And in the quiet hours when the hallways went still, some staff swore they could hear faint voices humming. A melody with no breath, no words, only rhythm. 8 notes, over and over, waiting to be finished. The decision to confiscate Eli's sketch pad came after the matron discovered 2 children sitting motionless at the foot of the chapel steps, eyes fixed on a drawing that Eli had slipped under the door during evening prayers. It showed the orphanage from above, roof removed, walls peeled open, and inside each child rendered in thin black lines curled up in identical positions. The only figure upright was Eli standing over a page within the drawing, one hand outstretched, holding a quill too large for a child. What disturbed her more than the image itself was the detail. The exact placements of beds, of chairs, of the spoon left beneath the hallway radiator 3 days earlier. She took the sketch pad from his room that night while he slept. She locked it in the chapel storeroom and instructed staff to keep Eli under close observation. Though he offered no resistance, only sat quietly with his hands folded, blinking slowly at nothing. 2 days later, Father Halloway unlocked the storeroom to examine the pages more closely. He had grown obsessed with the drawings, not because of their artistry, but because of their precision. Each one held something not just imagined but known, angles from perspectives impossible for a child to understand. But when he opened the book, the most recent page was different. It smelt faintly of iron. The lines were darker than charcoal, with a reddish hue where the edges had dried unevenly. He touched the tip of one curl and felt its grain. It was not graphite. It was crusted and organic. He sent a sample to the small medical mission downstate, without explanation. The results returned 1 week later, carried in a sealed envelope marked unsolicited, possible fraud. The sample, according to the examiner, was human blood, dried, old, but intact, and the type was extremely rare. A B negative, the enclosed note added one final detail, almost an afterthought. The DNA profile, though incomplete, matched the remains of a child reported missing from Gordon County in 1872. The name had been Clara Wick. She was 7 when she vanished walking home from her aunt's house. Her body was never recovered, and only a shoe found near the edge of a dried creek bed. She was last seen near a wagon driven by an unregistered man traveling south. But no one ever found the man. No one ever searched the orphanages. Eli had appeared at Briar Glen 1 year later. No records, no birth date, only a pad, a name he did not give himself, and eyes that seemed to remember things no one had spoken aloud. The matron burnt the page in secret, but the next morning the drawing was there again, this time inked into the underside of her desk, deep and scabbed into the wood. The same lines, the same red. From that point forward, the staff stopped confiscating Eli's drawings. They said nothing when he began carving symbols into his bed frame. They pretended not to see when he started sketching in the air with his finger. Because something in the blood had spoken, and they had begun to suspect that Eli hadn't drawn Clara Wick's blood out of memory, but from the source, one they could no longer define by time. His name was Samuel Creel, a man with gray on his temples and calluses on his fingers, known in the southern dioceses for building churches that felt older than the ground they stood on. He traveled alone, with only a rolled canvas tube of blueprints and a leather-bound notebook no one but he had ever opened. When the diocese sent him to Dalton to design a new chapel for the Northern Mission, they suggested he stop by Briar Glen, perhaps to assess its chapel's crumbling condition, perhaps for inspiration. But Samuel had already drawn something strange, something he never shared. It had come to him months ago in his sleep, like a dream that arrived not from his own mind but from somewhere deeper, older. Every time he tried to change its angles, the ink bled. The steeple always returned to its unnatural height. The doorways remained arched like jaws. When he stepped inside Briar Glen, the cold struck him not from the air but from the walls themselves, like they exhaled. The matron gave her usual rehearsed tour, half out of duty, half out of guilt. The children avoided him. Only one watched, a boy sitting on the floor by the stairwell, sketchpad in his lap. The matron said his name was Eli, then lowered her voice and said nothing more. Samuel nodded and asked to see the chapel. She led him down a dim corridor to the warped oak doors and left him to examine them in silence. The space inside was simple: stone walls, broken pews, and a rotted pulpit. But when Samuel stepped toward the altar, he paused. A drawing had been pinned to the wood, its edges curling. Done in charcoal, it depicted a church, not the one he stood in, not one he recognized, but the one he had drawn himself in secret in a rented room by lamplight, week after week, unable to stop. His throat went dry. Every line matched, the stained glass arrangement, the cracks in the foundation, even the impossible spiral staircase that led to a door suspended in the steeple's air. It was his church, his private madness, rendered by a child. When he turned to ask who had drawn it, Eli was standing in the doorway watching him with eyes that did not blink. The boy held a new page. Samuel did not want to see it. He left the chapel without a word. He refused the matron's tea. He did not stay the night. The next morning, the diocese received a telegram. Samuel Creel had resigned his commission, citing irreconcilable visions. He left no forwarding address. Days later, a groundskeeper found Samuel's notebook beneath the boughs of a tree just outside the orphanage fence. The pages were blank. Every design was erased except one, a final ink-dark sketch of a church with no doors. Only windows filled with faces pressed against the glass, mouths open, waiting to be let in. Or out. The sound came at exactly 3:12 a.m. A single heavy bell, deep and resonant, rolling through the orphanage like thunder underwater. It shook the windows. It woke every child at once. No one screamed, no one cried. They simply rose, barefoot and silent, and began to walk. Staff later claimed they were sleepwalking, but none could explain how every child, every one, made their way downstairs without a word. The hall was dim, the air was wet. Dust clung to the walls like ash. At the bottom of the staircase, the doors to the chapel were already open, though no one admitted to opening them. What they found inside would never be spoken of plainly again. The basement had flooded, but not with rainwater or sewage or burst pipes. The water was still black and cold, higher than it should have been, reaching over the final step, perfectly level. Yet no storm had passed. No leak was found. Beneath the surface, visible through the glassy dark, were pews. Not wooden, not old, but carved from stone. Pale and rounded, worn smooth by hands no longer living. 6 rows descending in a semicircle around something deeper in the center of the chapel's floor. Atop the pews sat shapes. Not bodies, not statues, but impressions. Depressions in the stone, as if something had once knelt there in prayer for a long, long time and had left behind only weight. In the very center of it all, waist deep in the black water, sat Eli, not standing, not floating, sitting as if invited. His arms rested in his lap. His eyes, half-lidded, stared at something no one else could see. Around him, on the surface of the water, floated scraps of paper. Thin, dissolving sketches, inked in red and black, drifting like petals. The drawings were unfinished, curling at the edges with lines reaching for one another across the current. One showed the inside of the basement exactly as it now appeared. Another showed the same space, dry but with children sitting in the pews, mouths stitched shut. The final visible page bore only a door. No handle, just a keyhole, wide as a child's eye. When Father Halloway stepped into the water, it didn't ripple. It accepted him, as though it had been waiting. He reached for Eli, who did not flinch, did not blink, but turned his head slightly and placed one hand on the priest's chest. What Father Halloway felt then he would never describe. Not pain, not fear, but recognition. As if the boy's hand had pressed through skin and bone and found something familiar in the dark. The bells never rang again. No one could find their source. The chapel had no bell tower. It never had. And yet, from that night onwards, the children began to draw them. Tall spires, twisted iron, black ropes. Always 8 bells. Always ringing in a place just below waking. Just beyond the sound of breath. And always seated at their center was the boy who had never needed to speak. Father Halloway had stopped sleeping. What began as unease had thickened into something heavier. A pressure behind the ribs, a pull at the base of the skull. He no longer trusted the chapel, the matron, or even the children who now stared too long at blank walls as if listening for something beneath the stone. But it was Eli who haunted him most, not through fear but through recognition. Something in the boy's presence didn't just feel wrong. It felt old. Older than memory, older than scripture. A silence so deep it had become sentient. In the second week of Lent, the priest traveled without permission to the diocesan archives in Macon, under the guise of retrieving burial records. What he sought lay deeper, in the sealed storage vaults where failed missions and closed parishes went to be forgotten. After hours of digging through baptism logs and transfer slips, he found a box with no parish name, just a number. 93A. Inside, beneath rotted cloth and brittle pages, lay a black ledger wrapped in leather so worn it felt almost like skin. No crest, no date, no name. just a single thread looped through a bone clasp. The entries inside were handwritten in multiple scripts spanning centuries. The ink changed, but the format remained the same. Each record listed an orphanage, a year, and a brief description. Child mute, sketching structures, night disturbances. Then a phrase in Latin, always different. Then a date of disappearance. 14 entries, 14 locations across southern states. Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia. Some dated back to 1702. One occurred in the exact year the diocese was founded. In several, the child's name was not given, only an initial. But in two, the name Eli appeared clearly, once in 1824 and again in 1896. In the margins of the oldest pages, someone had drawn identical symbols. Spirals inside broken circles surrounded by dots arranged in eights. One looked exactly like the carvings now etched into the underside of the pews at Briar Glen. The final entry chilled him to the bone. It was dated 20 years in the future. Site, undetermined. Status, awaiting return. Subject, still sketching. No signature, no handwriting. Just a single fingerprint pressed in blood beneath the final word. A word that had appeared before in Eli's pages, in the basement water and in the dreams that had begun to chase the priest even while awake. Sanctificare, to sanctify, to set apart. Father Halloway copied the ledger's contents by candlelight. He dared not take the book. By dawn, he had returned to Briar Glen and buried his notes beneath the altar, sealing them with wax. He knew now that Eli was not from the orphanage. He was not of any time. He was part of something ritualistic, cyclical, and patient. And whatever had arrived with him had been here before, not in years, but in centuries. Every church is built on soft land. Every orphan whose silence was mistaken for healing. Every ledger that was meant to be lost. And every hand that traced circles in the dark, waiting to draw the door once more. The chapel had not held a true mass in weeks. After the bells, after the drawings, after the black water in the basement, the rites had faltered. Hymns went unsung. Confession boxes remained empty. Holy water turned cloudy overnight. But Father Halloway, frayed by sleeplessness and visions that bled into waking hours, insisted on one final service. He said it would bring clarity. He said it would set things right. He said it would be small, only for those who understood. On a gray morning with no sunrise, he lit the chapel candles himself. The air was heavy with the smell of wax and mildew, and the pews stood empty except for one child seated in the front row. Eli, hands folded, sketchpad absent. He had come without it for the first time. He said nothing. He only watched. Father Halloway stepped to the altar. His voice cracked on the opening blessing. As the liturgy began, the priest no longer read from Scripture. The words he spoke were not Latin, nor English, nor any language the records would name. They came out in patterns, spirals of breath, chanted like a man translating from a place deeper than memory. The cadence was wrong. The rhythm was too still. But Eli remained seated, still and present, like he had been waiting for this moment long before it was spoken aloud. When it came time for communion, there was no bread, no chalice, no plate. There was only silence and then movement. Slow, deliberate, as the priest reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small blade wrapped in black linen. He held it up, eyes wet, trembling but resolved, and opened his mouth. With one slow motion, he sliced through the base of his own tongue. Blood filled his throat. He did not scream. He fell to his knees before the boy, cupped the severed piece in his palm, and offered it with bowed head, not as a gift, but as a surrender. Eli accepted the gesture without speaking, without blinking, and without lifting a hand. He only smiled, his first recorded smile, thin and calm and knowing. The priest collapsed moments later, blood soaking into the cracks of the chapel floor. His body was found hours after the matron noticed the locked door. They forced it open and found him at the base of the altar, kneeling even in death, arms clasped in prayer, his eyes sewn shut with strands of golden hair. No needle was ever found, no hair was missing from any child. An autopsy was refused. His body was buried behind the chapel under a blank stone. The diocese ruled it a breakdown, a tragic private unraveling of the mind. The children were never told what he had done. But in the weeks that followed, some began murmuring in their sleep, mimicking the same unplaceable cadence he had used. One girl woke up with her lips stitched with thread she could not recall touching. Eli never returned to the chapel, but the drawings resumed, now more detailed, more brutal. One showed the priest kneeling, as he had been found, but behind him loomed a figure that had not been present in life. A tall, eyeless thing, arms too long, stitched at the wrists with children's fingers. In place of a mouth, it bore a wound, circular, gaping, hung with nails like teeth. The matron burnt that drawing, then burnt the next one. But they kept returning. Each night under her door, each morning under her bed, she stopped trying to destroy them. She placed them in a drawer, one after another, and stopped locking her room at night. What Father Halloway had surrendered was not just his voice, it was his place. The communion he offered was not sacred, it was a seal, and Eli, smiling in silence, had accepted it not with hunger but with patience. Because what needed to be spoken had already been drawn, and what had once required a priest now needed only a witness. It began with smoke. On a March morning in 1884, while the sky was still bruised with winter and the ground frozen hard beneath the roots, Briar Glen Orphan Asylum burnt. There was no lightning, no accident, no cause anyone could name. One moment it stood grim and silent at the edge of Dalton, and the next, flames climbed its stone throat like vines made of fire. The blaze was silent at first, no crackling, no screams. Only the smell, thick and sweet, like burning cloth soaked in blood. By the time the townspeople reached it, the upper floors had collapsed inward and the sky above pulsed orange. No one could say how many were inside. No count had been made. No list had been kept. Only one name was spoken aloud by those who stood watching the flames, Eli. But nobody was found in the ashes, not his, not the matron's, not the priest's, and yet something lingered. A heat that refused to die even as the embers cooled. For weeks afterward, nothing would grow on the land. Not weeds, not moss. Even flies avoided it. Some said the fire had revealed something buried. Symbols scorched into the foundation, blackened spirals in the soot. Others claimed to see shapes walking through the smoke, barefoot children with no mouths, holding candles that did not flicker. By summer, the land lay still, empty, undisturbed. But in early September, something changed. At first, it was just a shadow on the hill, long and narrow, cast by no object, moving with no sun. Then, on the first Sunday of the month, a boy fishing in the creek swore he saw a spire in the distance. When he returned the next morning, the church was there, fully formed, made of pale gray stone that shimmered like bone in early light. No scaffolding, no tools, no laborers. It had not been built. It had arrived. News spread fast. Locals came in wagons, in carriages, and on foot. They circled the church, touched its walls, and peered through the stained glass windows that bore no saints, only symbols. The spiral, the door, and the hanging rope. The front door remained sealed, heavy iron, nailed shut, no hinges, no keyhole, just silence. But those who pressed their ears to the stone swore they heard singing inside, faint, childlike, and slow. 8 voices, always 8. 6 weeks later, a traveling bishop arrived from Atlanta. He demanded the doors be broken. Men came with axes and hammers. But the tools splintered. The door did not. In frustration, they shattered one of the stained glass panes near the apse. Inside, in the half-dark, they saw pews made of polished black wood, and beyond the altar a mural, large, unmistakable, Eli. He sat on a throne of ash, barefoot, hands resting on a child's sketch pad. His head was crowned with thorns, and behind him, where wings should have spread, there were ropes, 8 of them knotted and coiled like waiting hands. Beneath the mural were no words, only the same red spiral carved into the stone. No one entered after that. The bishop ordered the church condemned. Fences were raised, but by spring the fences had rotted. The path to the church returned, and the door remained, not open but closer. Each month the spiral in its center turned slightly. The town learnt to stop asking. Children were warned never to play near the hill. But some still came. They said they saw a boy there, not older, not younger, just waiting, holding a book, drawing on the air. And when they described his face, their parents said they were mistaken, that there had never been a boy named Eli, that the orphanage had burnt because of mold or madness or lightning. No one remembered. But at night, when the wind was low, the bells rang. 8 notes, slow and even. And somewhere behind the door that no longer needed to open, the congregation waited. Mouths closed, hands folded, eyes wide, listening to the boy who never stopped drawing. In the years that followed, time did not erase Briar Glen. It did not soften it. It only pushed it beneath. The stone church that stood where the orphanage once smoldered remained untouched. No aging, no cracking, no ivy reaching toward its heights. But no one dared go near. The townspeople told stories in hushed tones. Their children were warned away from the hill. And the few who ventured close returned changed, quieter, sleepwalking, or drawing things they claimed they had never seen. The diocese said little. Officially, the site had been closed for safety. Privately, they passed a motion in 1906 buried deep within a stack of state petitions, a clause outlawing unmonitored religious orphanages. No names were cited, no reasons given. It passed without debate. The law did not mention Briar Glen, but everyone who mattered understood. In 1923, during land surveys ahead of proposed rural expansion, a team of stoneworkers was dispatched to reinforce the foundation of the church, which, despite decades of disuse, had not shifted by a single inch. They dug only 6 feet before striking something, not rock, but iron, rustless and cold. Beneath the church floor was a sealed vault, square and smooth, with no seams visible and no keyhole to force. When opened with heat and pry bars, it exhaled something that made the men retch. Not the smell of death, but of stillness. Inside were no coffins, only jawbones, 43 of them, arranged in rows, each cleaned and set with eerie care, still bearing the curve of youth. Beneath the bones, a fresco had been painted on the vault's interior, a tree but not of leaves. Its roots were made from tiny arms, each bent upward as if reaching for the soil that once lay above them. The discovery was never made public. The vault was resealed. The church was fenced again, then later erased from maps. But some copies of the fresco's tracing made their way to libraries and archives labeled anonymously. And in the decades that followed, patterns began to emerge. Small stories, strange cases. Every few years in different counties, someone would mention a child. Always mute, always new, always sketching a church no one had seen. The structure never changed. The door always had no handle. The steeple always leaned too far. And the drawings always ended with a spiral. One such child was recorded in 1954 in Mississippi. Another in 1978 in northern Alabama. A third in 1999 in a foster home outside Atlanta. None of them stayed long. The children either vanished or were transferred. In one instance, the child's room was found empty except for hundreds of drawings pinned corner to corner, layered into one another until the walls themselves disappeared beneath ink. In another, the child's sketchpad was found buried beneath their bed, pages soaked with blood that matched no one in the facility. No one ever found Eli again, but his face remains in the mural. His spiral still appears in places where children sit too quietly. And the sound of bells, always 8 notes, always at 3:12, is still reported by those who live near the forgotten ground. The church remains locked, but the drawings continue. And somewhere, in the quiet moments before sleep, hands still reach for the page, drawing lines that are not taught, not learned, only remembered.